The November wind cut through the New Mexico territory like a blade, carrying the scent of sage and the promise of an early winter. Thomas McKenna pulled his worn leather coat tighter as he rode along the perimeter of his sprawling ranch, checking fence lines that seemed to stretch endlessly into the rust-colored horizon. At 53, his weathered face bore the deep lines of a man who had spent decades under the relentless southwestern sun, and his gray eyes held the distant look of someone who had grown accustomed to solitude. McKenna had bought this land 15 years ago, after the Apache Wars had finally ended, when most folks were still too afraid to venture this far into what they called hostile territory. But Thomas had never been like most folks. He preferred the company of his cattle and horses to the gossip and judgment of townfolk. His nearest neighbor was 20 miles away, and that was exactly how he liked it. The ranch house sat like a weathered sentinel against the backdrop of red mesas and endless sky. Built from local stone and timber, it was sturdy but Spartan, reflecting the practical nature of its owner. Thomas had never married, never saw the need for it. His life was simple: tend the cattle, maintain the land, and keep to himself. It was a life that had served him well, even if the loneliness sometimes pressed against his chest like a physical weight. As he rounded the southern boundary, something caught his eye near the old creek bed that ran dry most of the year. A flash of color against the pale yellow grass, something that didn't belong in the natural palette of the desert landscape. Thomas urged his horse closer, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle secured to his saddle. In this territory, caution was a survival skill. What he found made him dismount immediately. There, crumpled beside a cluster of prickly pear cactus, lay a small figure wrapped in tattered blankets. A child, barely breathing, her dark skin ashen with fever and dehydration. She couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old, with long black hair matted with dust and blood from what appeared to be a head wound. "Jesus," Thomas whispered, dropping to his knees beside her. The child's breathing was shallow and irregular, her lips cracked and bleeding from thirst. She wore traditional Apache clothing, a deerskin dress decorated with intricate beadwork, though it was now torn and stained with blood and dirt. Thomas had seen enough death in his lifetime to recognize when someone was standing at its doorstep. This little girl was dying, and she was dying alone. Whatever had happened to her, whoever had left her here, she was now his responsibility. He couldn't live with himself if he rode away and left her to die. Carefully, he lifted the child into his arms, surprised by how light she was. She stirred slightly at his touch, her eyes fluttering open briefly to reveal dark pupils dilated with pain and fever. She tried to speak, but only managed to whisper in Apache that Thomas couldn't understand. "Easy now, little one," he said softly, his voice gentler than it had been in years. "You're safe now." The ride back to the ranch house seemed to take forever. Thomas kept the child wrapped in his coat, checking her breathing every few minutes. She remained unconscious, her small body burning with fever. By the time he reached the house, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Inside, Thomas laid the child on his own bed, the only bed in the house. He had built a life of solitude, and his home reflected that choice. The main room served as kitchen, dining room, and living area, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and shelves lined with books, his only companions during the long winter evenings. He lit the oil lamps and built up the fire, then turned his attention to the child. Her fever was dangerously high, and the head wound, though not deep, had become infected. Thomas had learned basic medical care during his years as a cavalry scout before he'd grown tired of the violence and decided to make his own way in the world. Working by lamplight, he cleaned the wound as gently as possible, applying the antiseptic he kept for treating injured cattle. The child moaned softly, but didn't wake. Her breathing was still shallow, and Thomas knew the next few hours would be critical. He spent the night in a chair beside the bed, cooling her fever with damp cloths and trying to get small amounts of water between her lips. Every few minutes, he would place his hand on her chest to make sure she was still breathing. It was the longest night of his life. As dawn broke over the desert, painting the mountains in shades of gold and pink, the child's fever finally broke. Her breathing became deeper and more regular, and some color returned to her ashen cheeks. Thomas allowed himself a small smile of relief. She was going to live. But as he sat there in the growing light, watching over this small Apache girl who had somehow ended up on his land, Thomas McKenna had no idea that his act of compassion was about to change both their lives forever. The child woke on the third day, her dark eyes wide with fear and confusion as she took in the unfamiliar surroundings. Thomas had been reading by the fireplace when he heard her stirring, and he approached the bed slowly, his movements careful and non-threatening. "Easy," he said softly, his hands visible and empty. "You're safe here. I'm not going to hurt you." The girl tried to sit up but winced in pain, her hand moving instinctively to the bandaged wound on her head. She spoke rapidly in Apache, her voice weak but urgent, and Thomas wished desperately that he could understand her. "I don't speak your language," he said, pulling a chair closer to the bed. "But I know you're scared. I found you 3 days ago near death. You've been very sick." The girl's eyes darted around the room, taking in the simple furnishings, the books on the shelves, the rifle mounted above the fireplace. When her gaze returned to Thomas, he saw intelligence there, and a wariness that seemed too old for such a young face. "My name is Thomas," he said, pointing to himself. "Thomas McKenna. This is my ranch, my home." He gestured around the room, then pointed to her. "What's your name?" The girl studied him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether to trust him. Finally, she spoke a single word. "Ayana." Thomas nodded, smiling slightly. "Ayana, that's a beautiful name." He pointed to himself again. "Thomas," then to her. "Ayana." She repeated his name, her pronunciation careful and deliberate. "Tohmas." "That's right." He stood up slowly. "Are you hungry? Thirsty?" At the mention of food and water, Ayana's eyes brightened and she nodded. Thomas brought her a cup of water and watched as she drank it slowly, savoring every drop. Then he heated some broth he had made from beef bones and vegetables, serving it to her in small portions so she wouldn't make herself sick. As she ate, Thomas studied her. Despite her ordeal, she had a quiet dignity about her, a strength that reminded him of the Apache warriors he had encountered during his scouting days. Her clothes, though torn and stained, were beautifully crafted, suggesting she came from a family of some standing within her tribe. "What happened to you?" he asked gently, knowing she couldn't understand the words, but hoping his tone would convey his concern. "Where is your family?" At the word family, Ayana's expression changed. Tears welled up in her eyes and she spoke rapidly in Apache, her voice rising with emotion. Thomas didn't need to understand the language to recognize grief and loss when he heard it. "I'm sorry," he said, reaching out to touch her hand gently. "I'm so sorry." Over the next few days, as Ayana grew stronger, they developed a system of communication that combined simple English words, Apache phrases, and gestures. Thomas learned that she was 9 years old and that her family had been killed in a raid by a group of white men, not soldiers, but civilians who had attacked their small band while they were traveling to winter grounds. Ayana had hidden in the rocks during the attack, but when she tried to find help, she had fallen and hit her head. She had wandered for days, delirious with fever and thirst, before collapsing near Thomas's ranch. The story filled Thomas with a familiar anger, the same anger he had felt years ago when he witnessed the senseless violence that seemed to define the relationship between white settlers and native peoples. It was part of the reason he had left the cavalry and chosen a life of solitude. "You're safe now," he told her repeatedly, and gradually she began to believe him. As the days passed, Ayana began to explore the ranch house, her natural curiosity overcoming her initial fear. She was fascinated by Thomas's books, running her fingers over the leather covers and asking him to read to her. He started with simple stories, and she listened intently, repeating English words and teaching him Apache words in return. Thomas found himself looking forward to their conversations, broken as they were by the language barrier. It had been years since he had shared his home with another person, and he was surprised by how much he enjoyed her company. Ayana was intelligent and quick to learn, with a sense of humor that emerged as she felt more secure. She helped him with simple chores around the ranch, proving herself surprisingly capable despite her small size. She had a natural way with the horses, and they seemed to respond to her gentle touch and soft voice. Thomas taught her to milk the cow and gather eggs from the chickens, tasks she approached with careful concentration. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, and Thomas would tell her stories about the land, the animals, and the stars. Ayana would share stories from her Apache heritage, tales of Coyote the trickster and the sacred mountains. Even with the language barrier, they found ways to communicate these stories using gestures and drawings to fill in what words couldn't convey. But Thomas knew this peaceful interlude couldn't last forever. Ayana had a people, a culture, and he was just one man who had found her by chance. She needed to be with her own kind, to learn the ways of her ancestors and find her place in the world. The question was how to make that happen without putting her in danger. The relationship between white settlers and Apache people was still tense, despite the official end of the wars. There were those on both sides who would see any interaction as a threat. As November turned to December, Thomas wrestled with this problem. He had grown attached to the child more than he cared to admit. She had brought light into his lonely existence, and the thought of losing her made his chest tighten with an emotion he didn't want to examine too closely. But he also knew that keeping her would be selfish. She deserved to grow up knowing her heritage, surrounded by people who understood her language and her culture. She deserved to have a family again, even if it wasn't the one she had lost. The decision, as it turned out, would not be his to make. The Apache rider appeared on the horizon like a mirage, wavering in the heat that rose from the desert floor, despite the December chill. Thomas spotted him through the window while he was teaching Ayana to write English letters, and his hand instinctively moved to his rifle before he stopped himself. "Ayana," he said quietly, not wanting to alarm her. "Someone's coming." She looked up from her writing tablet, followed his gaze to the window and gasped. The sound that escaped her lips was pure joy, and she ran to the window, pressing her face against the glass. "Takoda!" she cried, switching to rapid Apache as she recognized the rider. Thomas watched as the Apache warrior approached at a steady pace, his posture alert but not aggressive. He was a young man, perhaps in his early 20s, with the lean build of someone who had spent his life in the saddle. His horse was a magnificent paint, and both rider and mount moved with the fluid grace that marked them as products of the high desert. "Friend of yours?" Thomas asked, though he had already guessed the answer from Ayana's reaction. "Takoda," she repeated, beaming with excitement. "Brother, cousin." She struggled with the English words, then said something in Apache that Thomas took to mean they were related. The rider stopped about 50 yards from the house, well within speaking distance, but far enough to show he didn't intend immediate violence. He called out in Apache and Ayana answered, her voice carrying clearly across the desert air. Thomas couldn't understand the words, but the tone was clear enough. The young man was asking questions, and Ayana was answering them, her voice growing more animated with each exchange. Finally, Takoda dismounted and began walking toward the house, his movements careful and deliberate. Thomas stepped onto the porch, his hands visible and empty, but his body positioned protectively in front of Ayana. The two men studied each other across the dusty yard, each taking the measure of the other. Takoda was handsome in the sharp-edged way of the desert people, with high cheekbones and dark eyes that seemed to see everything. He wore traditional Apache clothing mixed with some white man's gear, a cloth shirt over deerskin leggings, a silver-adorned belt, and a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better days. "You are the one who found her," Takoda said in careful English, his accent thick but his words clear. Thomas nodded. 3 weeks ago, she was near death. "I am Takoda, son of Chief Nalnish. Ayana is my sister's daughter." His eyes moved to the child, who was practically vibrating with excitement behind Thomas. "We have searched for her since the attack on our winter camp." The young man's English was better than Thomas had expected, probably learned from traders or missionaries. There was no hostility in his voice, but Thomas could sense the underlying tension. This was a delicate situation that could go wrong quickly. "She's been safe here," Thomas said simply. "I've cared for her as best I could." Takoda nodded slowly, his gaze taking in Ayana's improved appearance. She was wearing one of Thomas's old shirts, belted and rolled up to fit her small frame, and her hair was clean and braided. The infected wound on her head had healed to a thin scar, and her eyes were bright with health. "You have done well," Takoda said, and Thomas heard genuine gratitude in his voice. She looked strong. Ayana could no longer contain herself. She ran to Takoda, who swept her up in his arms, spinning her around as she laughed. They spoke rapidly in Apache, and Thomas caught his own name mentioned several times. Whatever Ayana was telling her cousin, it seemed to be positive. When they finally separated, Takoda approached Thomas with a new expression on his face, one of respect and something that might have been the beginning of trust. "She says you saved her life," he said. "She says you were kind to her, taught her things, protected her." "She's a good kid," Thomas replied, uncomfortable with the praise. "Smart as a whip and brave as they come." Takoda studied him for a long moment. "Why did you help her?" Many of your people would have left her to die. The question hung in the air between them, and Thomas found himself thinking about the answer. Why had he helped her? It would have been easier to ride away to avoid the complications that came with getting involved. Because she needed help, he said finally. That's reason enough. Something shifted in Takoda's expression, a subtle change that Thomas couldn't quite interpret. The young Apache looked back at Ayana, who was chattering excitedly and pointing at various things around the ranch as if she were giving him a tour. She speaks of you as grandfather, Takoda said. Says you have many books that you teach her white man's writing. Thomas felt a pang at the thought of losing her. She's quick to learn, too quick sometimes, gets into everything. Takoda smiled at that, the expression transforming his serious face. Yes, she is known for this in our tribe. Her mother used to say she was born with too much curiosity for one person. The mention of Ayana's mother brought a moment of sadness to both men. Thomas had seen the grief in the child's eyes when she spoke of her family, and he could see the same pain reflected in Takoda's face. I should take her back with me, Takoda said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. Should you? Thomas asked. Where? To what life? It was a bold question, perhaps too bold, but Thomas needed to know. He had grown to care for Ayana, and he wouldn't let her go into a situation where she might not be safe or happy. Takoda was quiet for a long moment, watching as Ayana showed him the chickens she had been helping to care for. Our people. We are few now. The wars have taken much from us. The children who survive, they are precious beyond measure. But, Thomas prompted, sensing there was more. But we are still hunted by some, still feared. A child like Ayana. She needs to learn the old ways, but she also needs to learn how to live in the white man's world. The two worlds are not easy to balance. Thomas understood. It was the same dilemma that had faced native peoples across the continent, how to preserve their culture while adapting to a reality that had been forced upon them by circumstances beyond their control. What if she could learn both? Thomas asked. What if she could spend time with your people, learning the Apache ways, but also learn to read and write English, to understand white man's laws and customs? Takoda looked at him sharply. You would do this. Keep her here, teach her these things. If it's what's best for her, Thomas said. If your people would accept it. The young Apache was quiet for a long time, his eyes moving between Thomas and Ayana. Finally, he nodded slowly. I will speak with my grandfather, the chief. This is not a decision I can make alone. He paused. But I think perhaps the spirits brought her to you for a reason. That evening, as Takoda prepared to leave, he spoke with Ayana for a long time in Apache. Thomas watched from the porch, giving them privacy for their conversation. When they were finished, Ayana ran to him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Takoda says I can stay, she said in English, then repeated it in Apache for her cousin's benefit. He says I can learn both ways, white man's way and Apache way. Thomas felt relief wash over him, though he tried not to show it. If that's what you want. Yes, she said firmly. You are my family now too. As Takoda rode away into the gathering dusk, he called back to Thomas. I will return in 1 month with my grandfather's decision. Take care of our little eagle. Thomas watched until the rider disappeared into the desert shadows, then looked down at Ayana, who was holding his hand with both of hers. Little eagle? He asked. She grinned up at him. My Apache name. Ayana means forever flowering, but Takoda calls me Little Eagle because I soar high and see everything. Thomas smiled, thinking it was a fitting name. But as he tucked her into bed that night, he had no idea that word of his kindness to the Apache child was already spreading across the reservation, carried by Takoda's voice and the swift horses of the desert messengers. By dawn, the story would reach the ears of Chief Nalnish himself, and the old chief would make a decision that would change everything. Thomas woke before dawn, as was his habit, but something felt different about this morning. The desert air carried a strange quality, a sense of anticipation that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He moved quietly through the house, not wanting to wake Ayana, and stepped onto the porch with his cup of coffee. The first thing he noticed was the silence. Even the usual morning sounds, the rustle of small animals, the distant call of a hawk, the whisper of wind through sage, seemed muted. The second thing he noticed was the dust on the horizon, a thin line that stretched across the eastern sky like a brown ribbon. Thomas set down his coffee cup and walked to the edge of the porch. The dust cloud was moving closer, and as he watched, he began to make out individual shapes within it. Riders. Many riders moving in formation across the desert floor. His first instinct was to reach for his rifle, but something made him pause. The riders weren't approaching at a gallop or in the chaotic rush of a raiding party. They were moving at a steady, measured pace, their formation tight and disciplined. This wasn't an attack, it was something else entirely. Behind him he heard Ayana stirring in the house. She appeared at the door, rubbing sleep from her eyes, and then she saw the approaching riders. Her reaction was immediate and joyful. "Takoda!" she cried, running to the porch rail. "He brought the whole band!" Thomas counted as the riders grew closer. There were at least 90 of them, all mounted on fine horses, all wearing the traditional dress of Apache warriors. They rode in a perfect circle, their horses' hooves raising a cloud of dust that caught the morning light and turned it golden. As they approached the ranch house, Thomas began to make out individual faces. Takoda was there, riding at the front of the formation, but beside him was an older man with silver hair and deeply lined features. Even from a distance, Thomas could see the bearing of a chief, the quiet authority that commanded respect. "Chief Nalnish," Ayana whispered, her voice filled with reverence. "My great-grandfather." The riders slowed as they neared the house, and Thomas realized they were forming a perfect circle around his property. Not a threatening circle, but something else, something ceremonial. The horses moved with precision, their riders guiding them with subtle touches, until they had created a ring that encompassed the entire ranch yard. Thomas stood on his porch, Ayana beside him, and watched as the chief dismounted. He was an elderly man, perhaps in his 70s, but he moved with the fluid grace of someone half his age. His silver hair was braided with feathers and beads, and he wore a shirt of white deerskin decorated with intricate beadwork. Takoda dismounted as well, and together they approached the porch. The other warriors remained mounted, their horses perfectly still, their eyes fixed on Thomas with expressions of respect rather than hostility. "You are Thomas McKenna," the chief said in English that was only slightly accented. "The one who saved our little eagle." Thomas nodded, his throat suddenly dry. "I am." Chief Nalnish studied him for a long moment, his dark eyes seeming to look straight through to his soul. "My grandson tells me you offered to share the teaching of our child, to help her learn both the white man's ways and the ways of the Apache." "I did," Thomas said simply. The chief nodded slowly. "This is a thing that has not been done before. In the old days, such a thing would have been impossible. But these are not the old days." He gestured toward the circle of warriors. "I have brought my best men, my most honored warriors, to witness this moment. We have come to make a circle of honor around you, Thomas McKenna, because you have shown honor to one of our own." Thomas felt his knees go weak. A circle of honor was something he had heard about, but never witnessed. It was one of the highest honors the Apache could bestow, reserved for acts of extraordinary courage or compassion. "I don't understand," he said. "I just helped a child who needed help." "Yes," the chief said, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "That is exactly why we honor you. You saw past the color of her skin, past the history of conflict between our peoples. You saw only a child in need, and you acted with a good heart." Ayana stepped forward, her small hand finding Thomas's. "I told them how you cared for me," she said in English, then repeated it in Apache for the benefit of the warriors. The chief nodded approvingly. "She says you fed her when she was hungry, healed her when she was sick, taught her new things when she was curious. She says you treated her not as a prisoner or a burden, but as a granddaughter." Thomas felt his eyes burn with unexpected tears. She's special. She brought light into my life. "And now," the chief said, "if you are willing, we would like to make this arrangement official. Ayana will live with you, learning the white man's ways, but she will also spend time with our people, learning the Apache ways. She will be a bridge between our worlds." Thomas looked around at the circle of warriors, at their solemn faces and proud bearing. These were men who had fought in the Apache wars, who had seen their families killed and their land taken. Yet they were offering him trust, offering to share their most precious possession, their children's future. "I would be honored," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The chief smiled and placed his hand on Thomas's shoulder. "Then let us make it official in the Apache way." What followed was a ceremony unlike anything Thomas had ever witnessed. The warriors began to chant in low, rhythmic voices, their words carrying across the desert air like a prayer. They dismounted in unison, each man laying his weapons on the ground in a gesture of trust and respect. Then, one by one, they approached Thomas. Each warrior spoke a few words in Apache, which Takoda translated. "He says you have shown the true spirit of a warrior, protecting those who cannot protect themselves. He says your heart is good, and your actions have brought honor to both our peoples. He says he will tell his children and grandchildren of this day, of the white man who chose compassion over fear." As the ceremony continued, Thomas found himself overwhelmed by the gravity of the moment. These proud warriors, these fierce protectors of Apache culture, were accepting him as one of their own, not as a white man who had done them a favor, but as a true friend and ally. When the last warrior had spoken, Chief Nalnish stepped forward again. "From this day forward, you will be known among our people as Strongheart who protects. You will always be welcome in our camps, and any Apache who meets you will know that you are a friend." The ceremony concluded with the warriors remounting their horses and riding around the circle 3 times, their voices raised in a song of honor. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they began to disperse, riding back into the desert in small groups. Takoda remained behind with the chief, and together they spent the day working out the details of Ayana's unique education. She would live primarily with Thomas, attending the small school in the nearest town and learning to read and write English, but she would also spend several weeks each year with the Apache, learning their language, their customs, and their traditional ways. "She will be the first of a new generation," Chief Nalnish explained, as they sat around Thomas's dinner table that evening. "Children who can walk in both worlds, who can help our peoples understand each other." As the sun set over the desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, the chief and Takoda prepared to leave. But before they mounted their horses, the chief had one more thing to say. "The circle of honor we formed today is not just ceremony," he said to Thomas. "It is a promise. If you ever have need of help, if you ever face danger, you have only to send word to the Apache. We will come." Thomas watched as the 2 men rode away into the gathering dusk, their silhouettes quickly swallowed by the desert shadows. Beside him, Ayana waved until they were out of sight, then turned to him with shining eyes. "You are Apache now, too," she said seriously. "Strongheart who protects." Thomas smiled, putting his arm around her small shoulders. "I guess I am." As they stood on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the clear desert sky, Thomas reflected on how much his life had changed. 3 months ago, he had been a lonely rancher, content with his solitude and his simple existence. Now he was a guardian, a bridge between 2 worlds, and most importantly, a grandfather to a remarkable little girl who had taught him that family wasn't just about blood. It was about love, commitment, and the willingness to open your heart to another person. The circle of honor had been formed around his ranch, but Thomas knew that the real circle was the one that now surrounded his heart, a circle that included a brave Apache girl and the proud people who had entrusted him with her future. It was a circle that would never be broken, a bond that would endure for generations to come. In the distance, a coyote howled, and Ayana tilted her head to listen. "He's singing about today," she said with the certainty of a child who understood the language of the desert. "He's telling all the animals about the circle of honor." Thomas smiled, thinking that maybe she was right. Maybe the whole desert was talking about what had happened here today, about the moment when 2 cultures had come together in trust and respect. It was a good story, he thought, a story worth telling. As they went inside, Ayana chatted excitedly about her lessons with the Apache and her plans for the future. Thomas listened with half an ear, his mind still processing the events of the day. He had been honored beyond measure, but he also understood the weight of responsibility that came with that honor. He would make sure Ayana grew up to be worthy of the trust both cultures had placed in her. She would learn to read and write, to understand the ways of the white world, but she would also learn the ancient wisdom of her people. She would be a bridge, just as the chief had said, helping to heal the wounds between 2 worlds that had been at war for too long. It was a big job for a little girl, but Thomas had faith in her. She had already shown remarkable strength and resilience, and with the support of both her Apache family and her new white grandfather, she would grow into a woman who could make a difference in the world. As he tucked her into bed that night, Ayana looked up at him with serious eyes. "Thank you, grandfather," she said, using the Apache word for the first time. Thomas felt his heart swell with emotion. Thank you, little eagle, for everything." Outside, the desert wind whispered through the sage, carrying the scent of rain and the promise of new beginnings. The circle of honor had been formed, and it would endure as long as there were people willing to choose love over fear, understanding over hatred, and compassion over indifference. It was a lesson that would echo through the generations, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful force in the world is the simple act of one person helping another, regardless of the differences that might divide them. In a land that had seen too much conflict and bloodshed, it was a message of hope, and that message would spread far beyond the borders of one small ranch in the New Mexico territory. The circle of honor was complete.